There is a moment, and you've had it, where you look at your own hands and they don't feel like yours. Where you're in a conversation, laughing, responding, existing, and somewhere behind your eyes, something is watching, not participating, watching. Like you're a character in a film and you forgot you were supposed to be the director. You've felt this, maybe once, maybe more times than you're comfortable admitting. And here's the part that should unsettle you. That feeling isn't random. It isn't a glitch. It isn't fatigue or stress or too much coffee. It is your brain doing something extraordinarily specific, something that reveals a terrifying truth about the nature of consciousness, identity, and what it actually means to be you. Because the question isn't whether this happens. The question is, why does it happen at all? Why would a brain, the most sophisticated object in the known universe, suddenly decide to make you feel like a stranger inside your own life? Stay with me, because by the time we reach the end of this, you won't just understand the science, you'll understand something about yourself that you can't unfeel. Let's start somewhere unexpected. Let's start with a woman named Elena. She's 26 years old. She's sitting at a dinner table with her family, the people she's known her entire life, and she looks around the room and feels absolutely nothing. Not depression, not sadness, not numbness in the way we usually mean it. Something far stranger. The room looks real, her family looks real, but she feels like she's watching it all through a pane of glass, like reality itself has been wrapped in a thin layer of film, and she's pressing her face against it, unable to break through. She can speak, she can smile, she can pass the salt, but the feeling of being there, of being inside the moment, is completely gone. Elena spent 3 years thinking she was going insane. She wasn't. What Elena was experiencing has a name: depersonalization, and its twin, derealization. Two of the most disorienting, least discussed psychological experiences a human being can have. And here's what makes them so philosophically staggering. They affect an estimated 1 in 3 people at some point in their lives. 1 in 3. That's not a rare disorder. That's a feature of the human mind that we've barely begun to understand. But here's what's strange. The science doesn't just explain why Elena felt that way. It explains something about all of us. Because depersonalization and derealization aren't just clinical conditions. They sit at the far end of a spectrum that every single person alive occupies at some point, often without realizing it. And to understand why, we have to go somewhere most people never think to look. We have to go inside the machinery of the self. Your brain, right now, as you listen to this, is doing something that should honestly disturb you more than it does. It is constructing you, not observing you, not recording you, constructing you. Every sensation, every thought, every feeling of existing in a body, every sense of continuity between who you were yesterday and who you are today, all of it is being actively built by neural processes you have zero conscious access to. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger spent decades studying something he called the phenomenal self model, and his conclusion was radical enough to rearrange how I think about everything. He argued that what you experience as you, this continuous unified presence behind your eyes, is not real in the way you think it's real. It's a model, a simulation your brain runs, a controlled hallucination that your nervous system generates to help you navigate the world. The you that feels like it's watching your life, that feeling is the model. And sometimes, under certain conditions, the model starts to glitch. But that word, glitch, isn't quite right, because what's actually happening is far more deliberate than that. Your brain is constantly doing something called predictive processing. It is, at every moment, making predictions about what reality should feel like, and then comparing those predictions to the incoming sensory data. When the predictions match reality, the system hums along invisibly, and everything feels normal. When they don't match, when there's a prediction error, the system has to work harder, and it has to make a choice. Do we update the model of the world, or do we update the model of the self? When life becomes overwhelming, when stress accumulates beyond what the system can process gracefully, when trauma enters the picture, or chronic anxiety, or extreme sleep deprivation, or something you can't even name, the brain sometimes makes a very specific, very protective choice. It turns down the volume on you, not on the world, on you. It increases what neuroscientists call psychological distance between the self as observer and the self as experiencer. And suddenly, instead of being inside your life, you are watching it. The protagonist is still moving, still talking, still breathing, but the feeling of being that protagonist has been quietly, surgically removed. And the terrifying part is, the brain does this on purpose. Let's talk about why. Because this is where the story gets darker and more fascinating and more human than you might expect. Evolution is a ruthless engineer. It doesn't care about your happiness. It doesn't care about your sense of existential well-being. It cares about one thing: survival. And the capacity to mentally step outside yourself, to observe rather than experience, turns out to be an extraordinarily powerful survival tool. Think about it this way. Imagine you're facing a situation so terrifying, so overwhelming, so emotionally unbearable that full emotional engagement would paralyze you. What does a sophisticated survival system do? It creates distance. It shifts you from participant to observer. Because an observer can still function. An observer can still make decisions, calculate risks, take action, without being consumed by the emotional weight of the moment. Soldiers have described this. Survivors of accidents have described this. People in the middle of the worst moments of their lives have described looking down at themselves from above, watching calmly, almost curiously, as if it's happening to someone else. And in those moments, that detachment wasn't a malfunction. It was the brain performing an act of mercy. The clinical psychologist, Dr. Onno van der Hart, has spent his career studying what he calls structural dissociation, the way the mind fragments under pressure, allowing one part to continue functioning in the world while another part absorbs and processes the unbearable. And what he found is that this capacity isn't pathological in its origins. It's ancient. It's woven into the architecture of consciousness itself. But here's what's strange. What happens when the threat isn't a single moment? What happens when the threat is life itself? What happens when the background radiation of modern existence, the anxiety, the disconnection, the overstimulation, the relentless performance of being a person in the world, becomes so constant that the brain never quite gets the signal to turn the protection off? That's where it gets complicated. That's where Elena's dinner table comes from. We live, right now, in what may be the most dissociating era in human history. I don't say that for drama. I say it because the science is beginning to point there. Chronic stress, not acute, dramatic stress, but the slow, grinding, never quite resolved stress of modern life, consistently disrupts the brain's ability to integrate self-referential processing. The regions that normally stitch together your moment-to-moment experience into a coherent self, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the regions of what's called the default mode network, become dysregulated. The stitching loosens. And then there's dopamine, because this wouldn't be a complete picture without talking about what we're doing to our own reward systems. The average person in 2024 receives more novel stimulation in a single day than a medieval peasant received in a year. Every scroll, every notification, every piece of content is a tiny hit of novelty. And novelty is the primary fuel for the dopamine system. What happens when you overstimulate any system? It becomes desensitized. It raises its threshold. It needs more to feel anything at all. And one of the things the dopamine system is responsible for, one of the things it signals, is the sense that experience is meaningful, that what's happening right now matters, that you are truly fully here. When that system is chronically overstimulated and subsequently desensitized, the world can start to feel thin, flat, slightly unreal, like high-definition footage of life rather than life itself, like you're watching rather than living. Sound familiar? This is not a moral judgment. This is a neurological consequence of an environment our brains were never designed to inhabit. We are ancient creatures in an alien world, and our minds are responding in the only ways they know how. But let's go deeper, because this phenomenon, this feeling of watching yourself, has a history that stretches far beyond modern neuroscience. It stretches back to the very beginning of human philosophical inquiry. The ancient Greeks had a concept they called ecstasis, literally, standing outside oneself. They saw it not as a disorder, but as a state of profound spiritual and philosophical significance. The moment when the self becomes aware of itself as a self, when consciousness turns its own light inward and sees something. What exactly? That was the question that consumed Plato, that consumed Aristotle, that eventually consumed Descartes, sitting alone in his room in 1641, trying to find the one thing he could not doubt. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But notice what Descartes was actually saying. Not I feel, therefore I am. Not I exist, therefore I am. But I think. More precisely, I observe myself thinking. I am aware that I am aware. And that meta-awareness, that capacity to stand at one, remove from your own experience and watch it, that's what he used as the bedrock of certainty. The observer inside you. The watcher. That's not a glitch in human consciousness. According to some of the deepest threads in philosophy, it is human consciousness. But here's what's strange, and this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. If the watcher is real, if there really is something behind your eyes observing the film of your life, then what is it watching from? Where does the watcher stand? Because the watcher can't be outside your brain. Everything you experience, including the experience of watching, is happening inside a biological system, inside neurons firing in patterns, inside chemistry and electricity and flesh. So who's watching? What is watching? Neuroscientist Anil Seth, one of the most compelling scientists working today, has a way of framing consciousness that I think about almost every day. He says, your experience of being you is a controlled hallucination. Your brain takes incomplete sensory data, fills in the gaps with predictions and prior experience, and constructs a seamless, seemingly objective reality, including the reality of you, the person experiencing it, the feeling of being a continuous self, the feeling of being the author of your actions, the feeling of being inside your life, rather than at a distance from it. All hallucination, all construction, all model. Now, here's where this gets philosophically uncomfortable. If your sense of being fully present and fully you is a construction, then depersonalization isn't a case of your brain breaking down and showing you something false. It might be a case of your brain briefly failing to maintain the illusion and accidentally showing you something true. The thin glass Elena felt between herself and her family, that might not have been unreality. That might have been reality without the customary paint job, reality as it actually is, before the brain layers the warm, convincing feeling of selfhood over the top. And that is where this stops being a psychological phenomenon and starts being something that keeps you awake at night. Because if the sense of being you is something your brain generates rather than something that simply is, then who are you when the generator flickers? Who is watching when the watcher is itself a construction? And then something even stranger happens when you pull on that thread. There is a patient, documented in neurological literature, who suffered damage to specific regions of his parietal cortex following a stroke. He was otherwise completely intact, intelligent, verbal, self-aware, but he described something that researchers found almost impossible to process. He said that he could feel himself thinking. He could observe his own thoughts arising, but there was no sense that the thoughts were his. They were just thoughts, occurring in a space that happened to be where he was. He didn't feel like he was having experiences. He felt like he was witnessing them. He described it not as terrifying, but as peaceful, as if, for the first time, he understood something he couldn't articulate. This isn't an isolated case. Across traditions, across centuries, across cultures, meditators, mystics, philosophers, and now neuroscience patients have described variations of the same experience. The discovery that the sense of being a self is not a given. It's a gift the brain gives you, and like any gift, it can be taken away. Buddhist philosophy has meditated, literally, on this for 2,500 years. The doctrine of anatta, non-self, argues that what we experience as a unified, continuous self is an illusion, not an error, not a malfunction, an illusion that serves a function. Like a map serves a function, even though the map is not the territory. The map is not the territory. You are not you in the way you think you are you. And the strange thing, The genuinely eerie thing is that when people sit in meditation and systematically dismantle the feeling of selfhood, what they often encounter on the other side isn't nothing. It's something that feels more real, not less. More present, not more distant. As if by dissolving the watcher, they finally, paradoxically, find the thing the watcher was always trying to see. But let's come back to the ground, because I don't want this to float away into abstraction. I want this to land in your chest. Think about the moments in your life when you felt most like you were watching rather than living. Maybe it was at a party, surrounded by people, where something in you just quietly stepped back. Maybe it was in a long relationship, going through the motions of love, while some part of you observed, curious and uninvested, from a slight remove. Maybe it was at your own birthday, people celebrating you while you sat inside the celebration like a tourist in your own life. Maybe it was smaller than that. A Tuesday, a commute, a conversation about nothing, and you looked at your hands on the steering wheel and thought, who is this person? Is this really my life? Those moments are not failures of engagement. They are not signs that you're broken, or that there's something wrong with you, or that you don't love the people you love, or want the things you think you want. They are your brain surfacing a question that's been there since the beginning. Since the first moment a human being sat alone in the dark and thought, what am I? Not who, what. What is this thing that feels, and notices that it feels, and then notices that it's noticing? Your brain still remembers something ancient, something pre-language, pre-culture, pre-everything we've built on top of it, that beneath all the stories you tell about yourself, beneath the name and the face and the role and the relationships, there is something that watches, something that doesn't quite belong to the life it's observing. And that feeling, that mild dissociation from the ordinary, that sense of watching your own hands move, your own voice speak, that's not you losing yourself. That might be you getting closer to what you actually are. Let's talk about what this does to the way you live. Because there's a particular kind of suffering that comes from this experience that we don't talk about enough. A suffering that doesn't announce itself dramatically. It just sits there, slightly behind the eyes, watching. People who experience chronic low-grade depersonalization often describe the same thing. They go through all the right motions. They achieve. They connect. They laugh at the right moments. They say the right things. But nothing quite lands. Nothing leaves a mark. It's like writing in water. Everything passes through without trace. Joy doesn't accumulate. Love doesn't settle. Each experience arrives and then dissolves, leaving the observer exactly where they were. Psychologists call this experiential avoidance. But that framing misses something, because it implies a choice. It implies someone decided to stay behind the glass. Most people in this state would give anything to break through, to feel the heat of their own life on their face, to stop watching and start being. And this is where the science offers something that feels almost unbearably hopeful. Because the same neurological understanding that explains why this happens also begins to explain how it ends. And the answer is almost counterintuitive. The way back through the glass is not to push harder. It's not to chase intensity. It's not to overstimulate a system that's already retreated from overstimulation. Researchers studying the recovery from depersonalization consistently find the same thing. The path back to presence runs through the body, not the mind. Through sensation. Through the slow, patient, non-performative act of noticing, truly noticing, something real. The temperature of water on your hands, the specific weight of your feet on the ground, the texture of a surface that is undeniably, physically, right there. The brain is a prediction machine that builds a self, but it builds that self from the bottom up, from embodied sensation first. And when you give it the raw material of genuine physical presence, unhurried, unperformed, without agenda, the model starts to stabilize. The watcher and the lived are slowly pulled back toward each other, and the glass thins. Not immediately, not dramatically, but incrementally, like a figure coming into focus. There is a philosopher named Maurice Merleau-Ponty who spent his entire career arguing against the Cartesian idea of the mind as something separate from the body, a ghost in a machine, a watcher above a stage. He argued that consciousness is not behind experience. It is experience. It lives in the body. It thinks through the hands. It feels through the skin. The mind doesn't observe the world from a distance. It is always already reaching into the world, touching it, shaped by it, indistinguishable from it. And when you lose that, when you retreat into the observer position, when you become the ghost in your own machine, you lose something that isn't a luxury. You lose the very medium through which meaning is made. Because meaning doesn't come from watching. It comes from contact, from the collision of a self with the world that refuses to be merely watched. This is what the watcher always wants. Not to watch, to touch, to enter, to find a way back through the glass to the dinner table, the conversation, the ordinary Tuesday, the hands on the steering wheel, and feel that all of it is yours, that this is actually your life, and you are actually inside it, and there is no remove, no distance, no film between you and the fact of being alive. But let's hold both things at once, because I think that's the only honest place to stand. The experience of watching your own life is real. It happens. It can be devastating, and it can be addressed and understood and moved through. And at the same time, that watcher is not your enemy. It emerged from something ancient and protective and deeply human. It has watched you through your worst moments. It has held you at a distance from things you weren't yet able to face. It has kept you functional when full presence would have shattered you. The watcher is not the thing you need to destroy. It's the thing you need to understand, to meet with curiosity rather than panic, to ask not, what is wrong with me, but what is this trying to protect? Because that's the question underneath the question. That's what the feeling of watching your own life is actually asking, in the only language it knows. Not something is wrong with you, but something needs tending. Something is waiting. Something in here hasn't felt safe enough to come forward yet. And when you ask that question, really ask it, with genuine curiosity and without flinching, something begins to shift. The model starts to update. The predictions start to change, and slowly, gradually, by degrees that you might not even notice until one ordinary afternoon, you realize the glass has gone. You come back. Not to who you were, not to some fixed, stable, perfect version of yourself, but to the living, contingent, fragile, beautiful fact of being present in your own experience, of being the author and the character at the same time, of watching and being watched collapsing back into each other, of just being here. Here's what I want to leave you with. The fact that you've felt this, that you've ever looked at your hands and felt like a stranger, that you've ever been in a room full of the people you love and felt sealed behind glass, that doesn't make you damaged. It makes you one of the most sophisticated and self-aware forms of matter in the known universe, trying to understand what it is. Your brain is doing something astonishing and terrifying and almost unbearably lonely. It is trying to be aware of its own awareness. It is looking for the looker. It is trying to see the eye that sees. And sometimes that process goes all the way, and the ordinary feeling of selfhood dissolves, and you're left with just the watching, just the clear, still, slightly eerie sense of observation, without an observer, consciousness without a center, a film with no audience and no filmmaker, and no one to decide whether it's real. And in those moments, those strange, glass-edged moments, you are touching something that every mystic and philosopher and neuroscientist who has ever taken consciousness seriously has had to sit with. The possibility that the self is not a thing you have, it's a thing you do. A process, not an object. A verb pretending to be a noun. And like all processes, it can stutter. It can pause. It can briefly stop generating the warm, convincing illusion that you are someone in particular, living a specific life, in a real and solid world that is undeniably yours. And in that pause, in that gap between the self the brain usually builds and the bare, strange fact of awareness itself, there is something looking back at you. You won't be able to name it. You won't be able to hold it long enough to describe it. But you'll know you felt it. And you'll spend the rest of your life, every ordinary, precious, vanishing minute of it, wondering what it was.